My father stood up at the head of the mahogany table, unbuttoned his custom suit jacket, and dropped a glossy folder right next to my grandfather's plate. The crystal water glasses rattled. I sat frozen next to my husband, Leo. I was 28 years old, sitting in a private dining room at the Belmead Country Club, and I had no idea my father had stolen my infant son's pacifier to run a secret DNA test. He looked down at my grandfather, Harlan, who was celebrating his 80th birthday, and pointed a manicured finger at the folder. "You need to know what kind of blood is inheriting the Beaumont trust," my father announced. His voice was crisp and echoing off the acoustic ceiling panels. I ran a specialized genetic panel on the boy. I wanted to prove what Leo is bringing into this family. "The lineage is muddy, Dad. Generational poverty markers. If you leave your estate to Abigail's child, you are handing our legacy to someone who does not belong in our circle." Welcome to Maya Tells Stories, where we uncover the truth behind closed doors. Before we dive deep into this story, if you are new to the channel, please take a moment to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Your support means so much more than you might imagine. And by the way, leave a comment letting me know where you are watching this video from and what time it is where you live right now. I absolutely love reading those comments. The air in the private dining room vanished. I looked at the folder, then at my father, Richard. The sheer violation of taking my baby's pacifier to map his genetics made a sickening knot form in my throat. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to grab Leo and walk out, but my vocal cords paralyzed. I felt like a failure for bringing my child into a family that viewed him as a contamination. My husband, Leo, did not move. He was a first-generation college graduate who ran an organic heirloom seed nursery in the foothills of East Tennessee. His hands, resting near his plate, were thick with calluses from working the soil. He endured the sneers of my parents not out of weakness, but because he viewed their elitism as pathetic overcompensation. Leo reached beneath the table and gripped my knee, anchoring me to the floor. My mother, Patricia, kept her gaze trained on the floral centerpiece. She was a board member of the local historical society, a woman born into wealth who viewed social standing as a biological imperative. She enabled my father's cruelty out of a misplaced sense of duty, avoiding eye contact with me as if a direct glance might transfer Leo's blue-collar status onto her designer dress. Harlan stared at the folder. He was the patriarch, a man who built a regional freight and timber empire from nothing. He looked old tonight, his skin translucent under the warm chandelier light. Slowly, with a hand that trembled from age rather than fear, he opened the cover. He flipped past the executive summaries, ignoring my father's highlighted notes. His age-spotted finger traced the colorful genetic migration maps printed on the heavy stock paper. He stopped on page 4. The ambient hum of the country club disappeared. Harlan did not yell. He did not throw the dossier back at my father. He just kept tracing a specific line on the page, staring at a cluster of rare, marginalized Appalachian genetic markers localized deep in the Smoky Mountain foothills. A single tear spilled over Harlan's lower eyelid, tracking down the deep, weathered ravine of his cheek. "Dad?" my father asked, his confident posture faltering for a fraction of a second. "Do you see it? The bloodline isn't pure." "Shut your mouth, Richard," Harlan rasped. The polished corporate patriarch evaporated. The voice that echoed across the dining room was thick, guttural, and steeped in the mountain grit he had spent 50 years paying consultants to erase. Harlan looked up. The grief in his eyes was staggering. He looked at my father with an expression of profound, devastating pity. "You spent your entire life trying to scrub the timber sap off our name," Harlan whispered, his voice cracking. "You bought the right suits, the right zip code, the right friends. You tried to build a fortress so no one would ever call you a hillbilly again." My father swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. He took a half step back. "I protected us." "You sterilized us," Harlan corrected, closing the folder. He slid his gaze toward Leo, looking at my husband's calloused hands, and then finally he looked at me. My mother came from a tin roof holler in Greene County. I spent millions burying her history because I was ashamed. But this test, this DNA, does not show muddy blood, Richard. Harlan tapped the glossy cover of the dossier. This boy carries my mother's markers, the real blood, the people who survived the winters when the coal ran out. My mother let out a sharp, horrified intake of breath. Harlan pushed his chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the floor. He did not look at my father again. He signaled to the probate attorney sitting at the far end of the table, a silent observer until this exact second. Change the paperwork, Harlan ordered, the command final, leaving zero room for appellate debate. Bypass Richard. Everything goes to the boy. My father stood frozen at the head of the table. The aristocratic fortress he had spent 4 decades building had just been dismantled by a single swab of plastic. But as the shock drained from his face, a cold clinical calculation settled behind his eyes. He was not going to surrender his empire to an infant. He was going to burn my life to the ground first. The drive back to our Craftsman home in East Nashville after the birthday dinner was wrapped in a heavy, suffocating quiet. Leo kept both hands on the steering wheel while I stared out the passenger window, watching the streetlights blur into a continuous yellow streak. My mind was a tangled knot of betrayal and shock. We did not discuss what had just happened. There was no cinematic screaming match in the car or tearing of hair when we walked through our front door. We just checked on our sleeping son in his crib and lay awake in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise. The fallout arrived at 7 in the morning. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a mug of black coffee, while Leo was already out back tending to a tray of heirloom tomato seedlings. The sound of heavy tires crushing the gravel in our driveway made me set the mug down. I walked to the front window. My father had parked his sleek luxury sedan behind my battered Subaru. Richard Beaumont was a man who planned his wardrobe the way generals planned military campaigns. He never left the house without a silk tie and a razor-sharp crease in his trousers. But the man walking up my front steps looked terrifyingly fragile. He wore the same suit from the country club dinner, but the jacket was unbuttoned and wrinkled. The dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, betraying a night spent pacing the floors of his Belmead estate. I opened the front door before he could knock. The humid Tennessee morning air drifted into the foyer. I stepped aside, offering him entry into the home Leo and I had painstakingly restored by hand. My father stopped at the threshold. He looked down at the reclaimed oak floorboards and then back up at me. He refused to cross the line. He would not step foot inside a house paid for by agricultural labor. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. The paper was slightly crumpled where his hands had gripped it too tightly. He held it out to me. His hand was trembling. "I am trying to protect you, Abigail," my father pleaded. His voice lacked the booming resonance he used in his corporate boardrooms. It was a raw, ugly sound that scraped against my nerves. I looked at the envelope, but kept my hands at my sides. "What is that?" "It is a revised estate plan," he answered, his words rushing out in a desperate cadence. "I had my legal team drafted overnight. It restores your personal trust fund. It guarantees your financial independence for the rest of your life. All you have to do is sign a renunciation of Harlan's decree. You decline the position of trustee for the boy. You let things go back to normal." I stared at him, trying to process the sheer audacity of the offer. He was asking me to sell out my own child. He was offering me a lifeboat built entirely on prejudice and expecting me to climb aboard. "You want me to disinherit my son for a paycheck?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, rigid whisper. "You stand on my porch and ask me to erase him because his DNA does not match your country club standards." My father let out a ragged breath. The polished armor cracked, and for the first time in my 28 years of life, I saw the terrified child hiding beneath his expensive suits. "You do not understand how they operate," he said, his eyes pleading with me to grasp his twisted logic. "You grew up protected by the wealth I built. You never saw the ugly side of this town. When your grandfather first sent me to Montgomery Bell Academy, I was surrounded by the sons of politicians and oil barons. Harlan had money, but he did not have pedigree. He ate his meals like a man who spent his youth swinging an axe. He spoke with a mountain drawl that echoed through those prep school hallways." My father leaned forward, gripping the wooden porch railing. "They cornered me in the locker rooms, Abigail. The boys with the generational wealth beat me until my ribs bruised. They called me a hillbilly. They mocked the dirt under my fingernails and told me I would always be poor mountain trash wearing a borrowed uniform. I spent 40 years making sure no one in this city would ever look down on the Beaumont name again. I built a fortress for you." He pointed a shaking finger toward the envelope. "You think you are being noble by rejecting our society. You think Leo's rural charm is a virtue. But the people who run this state do not care about virtue. If you parade a child with muddy Greene County genetics through our social circles, they will devour him. They will find every vulnerability, and they will ruin his life just like they tried to ruin mine. I am trying to save your son from the cruelty of our own class." The air grew thick and heavy. I looked at the man who had read me bedtime stories and paid for my architectural preservation degrees. For a fleeting second, I felt a sharp pang of profound pity. He was not acting out of pure theatrical malice. He was acting out of untreated trauma. He genuinely believed that the only way to survive the world was to become the monster that had terrorized him in his youth. He was offering me the only kind of love he knew how to give, but it was a love entirely conditional on my compliance with his fear. I reached out and took the manila envelope from his trembling hand. A look of immense relief washed over his face. He let out a long sigh, believing he had successfully navigated the crisis and brought his stray daughter back into the fold. He believed his wealth had solved the problem. I looked down at the legal documents hidden inside the heavy paper. I thought about Leo waking up before dawn to tend to the soil. I thought about my grandfather weeping at the country club table, recognizing the forgotten heritage of his own mother. I thought about the resilience of the Appalachian people I spent my career studying and preserving. I held the envelope up between us and pushed it firmly back against my father's chest. He blinked in confusion, his hands instinctively rising to catch the heavy packet before it fell to the porch floor. My son will never need protection from his own roots, I told him. My voice was no longer a whisper. It was steady and grounded in the dirt my father feared so much. If the people in your circle try to mock him for where he comes from, I will teach him how to stand tall. I will teach him that there is more honor in his father's calloused hands than in any bank account you could ever offer. You are not trying to save my child. You are trying to save yourself from facing the fact that your entire life is an insecure performance. The silence that followed was dense and suffocating. I watched the physical transformation happen in real time. The raw, vulnerable father seeking connection vanished. The wounded prep school boy disappeared behind a thick wall of emotional ice. My father straightened his posture. He brushed a piece of invisible lint from his lapel. The dark circles under his eyes seemed to harden into sharp, calculating lines. The corporate tactician had returned, preparing to execute a hostile takeover. He slipped the rejected envelope back into his jacket pocket. He did not yell or issue a dramatic threat. He just looked at me with the cold, detached gaze of a stranger evaluating a liability. "You always were too naive for your own good, Abigail," he said smoothly. His tone carried the chilling cadence of a man who held the keys to the regional economy. "You think you can build a life on principle. We will see how long those principles last when the foundation starts to crack. He turned his back on me and walked down the steps. The gravel crunched under his expensive shoes. He climbed into his luxury sedan, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The morning sun filtered through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the driveway. I stood alone on the porch, feeling a sudden, terrible chill despite the heat. The personal rejection was over, and the professional siege was about to begin. I just did not realize how quickly he would move to cut off our oxygen. Retaliation in the zip codes of Belmead rarely involves raised voices or shattered glass. It arrives dressed in polite corporate terminology and registered mail. My father promised to test the foundation of my principles, and he did not waste time. He understood that when you want to break someone, you do not attack their pride directly. You starve their resources. When toxic families cannot control your emotions, they go after your wallet. What was the first thing they tried to take from you when you finally drew a line? Tell me your experience in the comments, because navigating financial abuse is a uniquely isolating nightmare. I spent the last 3 years building a historical preservation initiative dedicated to rural Tennessee architecture. My team specialized in restoring 19th century Appalachian smokehouses across the remote counties surrounding Nashville. These structures were the last physical remnants of a working-class history my father wanted the world to forget. They featured intricate mortise and tenon joints and fieldstone foundations that told the story of families surviving the harsh winters without modern conveniences. It was grueling, meticulous work, requiring specialized contractors to handle the rotting timber and delicate masonry. Our funding relied heavily on a prominent Middle Tennessee philanthropic foundation. My mother, Patricia, happened to sit on the executive board of that exact organization. I always treated my grants as earned merit separated from my family name. I was incredibly naive to think she would not use that leverage against me. 3 weeks after my grandfather altered his estate plan, the email arrived. It was sent from the foundation director, copying a dozen anonymous compliance officers. The message informed me that my grant disbursements were temporarily halted, pending a routine compliance audit of my nonprofit bylaws. They requested 5 years of itemized receipts, contractor tax forms, and specialized environmental impact studies that typically took months to generate. It was not a sudden illegal hacking of my bank accounts. It was an entirely legal, bureaucratic strangulation. My mother had weaponized the bylaws, using her board position to freeze 70% of my operating budget under the guise of fiscal responsibility. Within 10 days, my contractors stopped showing up to the job sites. I stood in the middle of a half-restored timber structure in Cheatham County, holding a clipboard while the foreman packed his tools into his truck. The smell of ancient, charred hickory hung in the air, a stark contrast to the modern panic rising in my throat. He avoided making eye contact with me, muttering an apology about needing steady pay to feed his kids. I could not blame him. My operating accounts held nothing but pending overdraft fees. I watched his taillights fade down the dirt road, feeling a cold grip tighten around my ribs. The project was dead in the water. The financial siege did not stop with my preservation initiative. My father targeted Leo next. Leo ran his organic heirloom seed nursery with a quiet, fierce dedication. He cultivated rare local strains of vegetables and native foliage. He spent years reviving near-extinct varieties like Cherokee purple tomatoes and greasy-cut short beans, supplying the most exclusive landscaping firms and farm-to-table restaurants in Nashville. His business thrived on reputation and word of mouth. He spent his days with his hands buried in the soil, coaxing life out of the earth. But those high-end landscaping firms and culinary groups were owned by men who played golf with Richard Beaumont every Sunday at the country club. The cancellations rolled in like a synchronized storm. Long-standing clients called our house, leaving brief, awkward voicemails, citing unexpected budget cuts or sudden shifts in their seasonal planting designs. A large, lucrative order for a commercial property in Brentwood was revoked hours before Leo was scheduled to deliver the inventory. He had already spent our personal savings to grow that specific foliage. My father was making quiet phone calls, pulling invisible strings across the regional economy to ensure our revenue plummeted to zero. He wanted to watch us drown so we would have no choice but to crawl back and beg for a life raft. The true weight of our situation manifested on a humid Tuesday evening. We sat at our small oak kitchen table. The surface was covered in a depressing mosaic of overdue utility bills, canceled invoices, and final warning notices from our insurance provider. From the hallway, I could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of our infant son, sleeping in his nursery. The ceiling fan clicked above us, pushing stagnant air around the room. I stared at a red past due stamp on our electricity bill. My chest felt hollowed out, replaced by a heavy, dense block of concrete that made drawing a full breath nearly impossible. Leo sat across from me, holding a pencil. He did not yell about the injustice of the situation. He did not curse my parents or blame me for standing up to my father on the front porch. He possessed a stoic mountain resilience that baffled my parents, but anchored my soul. I watched him open his laptop and navigate to a local agricultural trading forum. He uploaded a series of photos. I leaned forward, trying to see the screen. He was drafting a sales listing for his prized, refurbished Kubota tractor. It was the piece of machinery he had spent 3 years saving up to buy. It was the backbone of his nursery operations. I reached across the table and grabbed his wrist, stopping his hand over the trackpad. "You cannot sell the Kubota," I whispered, my voice cracking under the strain. "If you lose that, you cannot till the lower acreage next spring. Your yield will drop by half." Leo looked up from the screen. His eyes were steady, betraying none of the panic that was currently chewing through my nervous system. "It covers the mortgage for the next 4 months, Abby," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "A tractor is just painted metal and engine parts. We can rebuild an engine. We cannot rebuild if the bank takes the roof over our son." He gently pulled his wrist from my grasp and clicked the publish button. The listing went live. I stood up from the table, unable to sit still, while my husband liquidated his dreams to pay for my family's cruelty. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the darkening yard. My vision blurred with unshed tears. I spent the remainder of that week sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by paperwork, drafting desperate applications for independent federal grants. I scoured government websites looking for historical preservation funds that were immune to the influence of Belmead socialites. The blue glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark room late into the night. My fingers cramped from typing endless proposals, and my coffee mug left brown rings across my printed financial ledgers. Every form I filled out felt like throwing a pebble into a canyon, hoping it would hit the bottom. But federal grants took 6 to 9 months to process, and we had weeks left before our accounts collapsed entirely. I realized in those quiet, desperate hours just how deeply my parents controlled the ecosystem around us. They owned the social currency. They owned the philanthropic networks. They owned the unspoken allegiances of the local business elite. They were tightening a noose around our daily survival, proving that their reach extended far beyond the walls of the country club. We were bleeding out from 1,000 tiny bureaucratic paper cuts. The savings account was drained. The nursery was stalling. My career was buried under an avalanche of fabricated compliance audits. And the most terrifying part of sitting at that kitchen table was the undeniable truth lingering in the back of my mind. My father was starving us just to soften our defenses. The actual war, the legal battle over my grandfather Harlan's estate and the Generation Skipping Trust, had not even officially begun yet. The slow drip of financial ruin does not just empty your bank accounts. It erodes your fundamental character. I spent weeks priding myself on my stoic defiance, believing I was immune to the toxic elitism that governed my parents' lives. I thought my preservation degrees and my rejection of the country club lifestyle made me morally superior to Richard and Patricia Beaumont. I genuinely believed I was the noble architect fighting for working-class history, while my family orchestrated a bureaucratic siege against my funding. But starvation reveals who you really are when the armor cracks. I learned that day in July that you can spend your whole life running from your bloodline, only to discover you inherited their ugliest traits anyway. The sweltering Tennessee heat was suffocating that afternoon. The humidity wrapped around Nashville like a wet wool blanket, making the air heavy and hard to pull into your lungs. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my battered Subaru Outback, parked in the sprawling asphalt lot of a big box hardware store on Charlotte Pike. The air conditioning in the car had failed 3 days prior, and I could not afford the $200 repair bill. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck, staining the collar of my cotton shirt. I was staring at the glowing screen of my phone, holding a digital copy of a certified letter from the Municipal Zoning Board. The letter was the final nail in the coffin for my primary preservation project. Because the philanthropic foundation controlled by my mother had frozen my grant disbursements, I had missed 3 consecutive payments to the independent structural engineers inspecting the 19th century smokehouse. Without their signed safety clearance, the city inspector issued an immediate condemnation order. The timber structure I had spent a year mapping and securing was now legally slated for demolition by the county. I watched 365 days of grueling historical preservation evaporate into thin air, all because my father wanted to punish me for my son's genetics. I pulled up my banking application. The bold red numbers mocked me from the top of the screen, displaying a severe negative balance, generated by an automatic withdrawal for our homeowner insurance. My chest tightened until it felt like a steel band was wrapping around my ribs. The pressure of the last month, the canceled invoices, the sold tractor, the relentless silent warfare waged by my parents finally overwhelmed the levees I had built in my mind. A heavy tap on the passenger side window made me jump. Leo was standing on the hot asphalt holding a large plastic bag of discounted nitrogen fertilizer for his nursery. His worn denim work shirt clung to his shoulders, damp with sweat. He offered a tired but genuine smile through the glass. I hit the unlock button and he pulled the door open, dropping the heavy bag into the floorboard with a dull thud. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing the scent of topsoil and exhaust into the sweltering cabin. "They had it on clearance," Leo said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "I think I can stretch it to cover the late summer tomato crop if I mix it with the compost we started last month. It might just give us enough yield to salvage the restaurant orders." I did not reply immediately. I looked at the bag of cheap fertilizer, and then I looked at my husband. He was calculating soil yields to scrape together a few $100s while my parents were sitting in an air-conditioned mansion, casually destroying my career over a country club vendetta. He looked exhausted. He looked poor. And in that terrifying, singular moment of weakness, I looked at him and saw exactly what my father saw. I saw a man who could not provide the safety I was accustomed to. The dam holding back my fear shattered, and a wave of pure, unadulterated venom rushed out. "You think discounted fertilizer is going to fix this?" I snapped. My voice sounded foreign, echoing sharply in the confined space of the car. It was high and brittle, carrying the exact condescending cadence my mother used when scolding service workers. "Do you really think saving $20 on dirt is going to stop the city from tearing down my project tomorrow morning?" Leo frowned, the easy smile vanishing from his face. He shifted in the seat, confused by the sudden hostility. "Abby, I know the project got flagged today. We are going to figure out the appeals process. I was just trying to secure the nursery revenue so we do not fall behind on the mortgage again." "Figure it out," I yelled, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "How are we going to figure it out, Leo? We have no money. My contractors walked off the job. The foundation froze the grants. My father is strangling us to death. And you are sitting here talking about mixing compost like a damn peasant? The word hung in the humid air, suspended like a toxic cloud. Peasant. I had never used that word to describe my husband. It was a word pulled directly from the aristocratic vocabulary of Belle Meade. Leo stared at me, his dark eyes widening slightly as the insult registered. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself. He just sat perfectly still, letting the silence amplify my cruelty. But I could not stop. The panic had completely hijacked my brain, turning my fear into a vicious weapon. This is exactly what my father warned me about, I continued, my voice shaking with irrational rage. He told me that romanticizing poverty was a luxury for people who had a safety net. Well, the net is gone, Leo. We are drowning. And instead of fighting back, you are just quietly accepting it. You sold your tractor without even putting up a fight. You let those landscaping firms cancel your contracts, and you did not even threaten to sue them for breach of agreement. Your stubborn mountain pride is dragging us straight into bankruptcy. You act like suffering quietly makes you noble, but it does not. It just makes you a victim, and you are dragging our son down with you. For 5 agonizing minutes, I unleashed a tirade of classist resentment that I did not even know I harbored. I blamed him for my father's actions. I blamed him for my mother's betrayal. I took every ounce of stress and humiliation I had absorbed since that birthday dinner, and I hurled it directly at the man who had done nothing but support me. I poured the very elitism I despised in my family right over my husband's head, tearing him down for his lack of wealth and his working-class stoicism. Leo did not interrupt me once. He kept his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed straight ahead through the windshield, staring out at the heat waves shimmering off the parked cars. His jaw was set into a hard, rigid line, bearing the brunt of my emotional explosion, without offering a single word of justification. He took the hits because he knew the woman screaming at him was terrified, not malicious. When I finally ran out of breath, the silence in the Subaru returned heavy and absolute. The adrenaline crash hit me instantaneously, leaving a cold, hollow void in my stomach. The ringing in my ears faded, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I looked at Leo's profile, noting the deep exhaustion etched into his features, and the profound shame crashed over me like a physical strike. I realized what I had just done. I had essentially validated my father's secret DNA test. I had looked at the man I loved and punished him for the exact heritage my family found so repulsive. I had become the monster I was fighting. The steering wheel felt rough against my palms. I slumped forward, burying my face in my arms against the center console. The tears that followed were not born from fear or financial stress. They were born from a deep, sickening self-loathing. I sobbed uncontrollably, my shoulders shaking as the reality of my own hypocrisy settled in. I had broken the most sacred rule of our marriage by weaponizing his background. I am sorry. I choked out the words muffled against my sleeves. Oh God, Leo, I am so sorry. I do not mean it. I do not think you are dragging us down. I am just so scared. I do not know how to fight them when they control everything. I am so sorry. I braced myself for him to open the door and walk away. I deserved to be left alone in that sweltering parking lot. I deserved his anger and his resentment. Instead, I felt the sudden warm weight of his calloused hand resting on my shoulder. He leaned over the center console, pulling me gently toward him until my face was pressed against the rough denim of his shirt. He smelled of sweat and soil and safety. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight, while I cried out the last of the poison my family had planted in my mind. I know, Abby, Leo whispered, his voice steady and completely devoid of the anger I had earned. His rough thumb rubbed slow, calming circles into my back, choosing grace over the vindication he deserved. I know you are scared. They are trying to make you turn on me. They want you to believe the money is the only thing keeping us safe, but we are not going to let them break this. We are going to survive the dirt." He held me until my breathing slowed and the panic receded, leaving behind a gritty, desperate resolve. I pulled back, wiping my face, and looked at him. I promised myself in that stifling car that I would never again let my father's elitism speak through my mouth. The financial squeeze was nearly unbearable, but the social warfare was about to escalate rapidly. We had to face the very society that was funding our ruin, and the perfect battlefield was fast approaching at the most exclusive equestrian event in Nashville. The second Saturday in May always transforms Percy Warner Park into a battlefield disguised as a spring festival. The Iroquois Steeplechase is Nashville's premier equestrian event, but the horses are essentially background noise. The real sport is the rigid preservation of social hierarchy. It is a sprawling landscape of seersucker suits, wide-brimmed hats, pastel dresses, and catered bourbon tents. It is the exact environment where my mother, Patricia, thrived. She treated her premium reserved box near the finish line like a royal court, dispensing favors and freezing out rivals with the flick of a wrist. Months before my grandfather's birthday dinner tore our family apart, I had purchased general admission tickets for Leo and me. I wanted to show my husband the bizarre spectacle of my childhood. I debated staying home after the financial siege began, but surrendering our tickets felt like conceding defeat. I refused to hide in our house while my parents paraded around the park. We walked across the manicured grass of the general admission infield. The midday sun was bright, and the humidity was already making the air feel heavy. Leo wore a simple linen button-down and khaki trousers, carrying our infant son strapped to his chest in a canvas carrier. He looked effortlessly handsome, grounded, and entirely unimpressed by the staggering display of wealth surrounding us. I wore a floral sundress, trying to project a quiet resilience I did not entirely feel. We navigated the crowds, avoiding the sprawling tailgates and the groups of intoxicated college students trying to find a quiet patch of shade. Has a stranger ever shown you more loyalty than your own blood relatives? Share your story in the comments, because sometimes the people who share your DNA are the first ones to turn their backs when the crowd is watching. Our path toward the food vendors forced us to walk near the perimeter of the clubhouse, where the elite sponsor tents lined the paved walkway. I kept my head down, hoping to slip past the VIP section unnoticed. But the collision was inevitable. I heard the sharp trill of my mother laughing before I saw her. Patricia was standing at the edge of the pavement holding a mint julep in a silver cup, surrounded by her fellow Historical Society board members. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat that shadowed her face. As we approached the gap in the pedestrian fencing, her eyes locked onto mine. She saw me. She saw Leo. She saw the grandson my father was actively trying to disinherit, strapped to his chest. I expected a cold glare or perhaps a snide whisper to her friends. What she did was far more calculated and infinitely more cruel. Patricia did not just ignore us. She turned her back, shifting her posture to directly block the narrow opening in the walkway. She raised her voice, projecting her words so the entire group could hear. She instructed her guests to step closer together, claiming she wanted to take a group photograph. The women in their pastel dresses immediately obeyed, forming a solid, physical wall of silk and chiffon. They effectively barricaded the paved path. The surrounding elite watched the blatant shunning unfold. A few women peered over their sunglasses with thinly veiled amusement, exchanging knowing smirks. The message was broadcast loud and clear across the turf. We were untouchable. My face burned as a hot flush of profound humiliation climbed up my neck. My chest tightened, restricting my breathing. We were trapped behind a wall of my mother and her friends holding a baby, while the high society of Belmead looked on as if we were a circus exhibit. I felt the eyes of dozens of strangers burning into the side of my face. The sheer petty cruelty of grown women playing high school hallway games was staggering. My mother was willing to use her own grandson as collateral damage in a turf war over social obedience. I wanted to confront her, to demand she move aside, but causing a scene was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to look unstable. She wanted me to validate her narrative that I had lost my mind by marrying Leo. I swallowed my anger, tasting the bitter, metallic tang of adrenaline in the back of my throat. The only way around the human barricade was to step off the grass and walk through the muddy horse path that had been churned up by the morning races. Leo placed a protective hand over the back of our son. He did not say a word. He just gently guided me by the elbow, steering us off the pavement and into the damp, churned earth. The mud coated the edges of my sandals. The indignity of walking through the dirt while my mother and her friends stood on the clean concrete, sipping bourbon, stung sharper than a physical strike. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, fighting the tears of shame that threatened to spill over. Patricia had executed her public punishment flawlessly, demonstrating her power to erase us from the social map. But high society is not a united front. It is a viper nest of competing grudges and ancient vendettas, and my mother had accumulated her fair share of enemies. Just as we cleared the muddy stretch of the path, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the ambient chatter. "Abigail Beaumont, is that you, darling?" I looked up. Standing at the entrance of a massive, ultra-exclusive sponsor tent directly across from my mother was Caroline Wentworth. Caroline was a formidable socialite whose family wealth dwarfed my parents' portfolio. She was also a woman who held a legendary grudge against Patricia. 5 years ago, my mother had lobbied the Historical Commission to block a lucrative zoning variance Caroline requested for a commercial property. Caroline never forgot the slight. She stepped out from under the shade of her tent wearing a vibrant emerald dress. She did not offer a polite wave. She marched directly over to the edge of the mud, grabbed my arm with a firm, manicured grip, and pulled me back onto the clean pavement. She ignored the mud on my shoes. She leaned in and kissed my cheek loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "It is far too hot to be walking the grounds," Caroline announced, her voice carrying a distinct theatrical projection. "You and your handsome husband must come sit in my tent. We have central air conditioning, and the catering is spectacular. Bring the baby out of this dreadful sun immediately." She did not wait for my response. She hooked her arm through mine and marched us straight into her VIP enclosure. It was a staggering display of social subversion. Caroline was not inviting me in out of the goodness of her heart. She was using me as a pawn to humiliate my mother. By elevating the daughter Patricia was actively trying to shun, Caroline effectively neutralized the public execution. Inside the tent, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The noise of the drunken crowds outside was muffled by thick canvas walls. We spent the remainder of the afternoon sitting on plush velvet lounge chairs in the shade. Waiters brought us plates of chilled shrimp and top-shelf bourbon in crystal glasses. Caroline cooed over our son and introduced Leo to a man who owned a chain of high-end boutique hotels in downtown Nashville. Instead of shrinking under the scrutiny of old money, Leo spoke passionately about crop rotation and the importance of native soil health. The hotel owner was captivated, handing Leo a heavy embossed business card and demanding a meeting to discuss supplying his restaurant kitchens. I watched my husband command the room with nothing but his authentic mountain grit. He did not need a custom suit to earn respect. He just needed an audience that valued substance over performance. I glanced across the walkway through the sheer mesh of the tent windows. My mother was standing at the edge of her box, gripping her silver cup so tightly her knuckles were white. Her group of friends had gone quiet, watching us sip expensive bourbon in a tent they did not have the social capital to enter. The wall of pastel dresses had crumbled into awkward silence. Leo leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his drink. He offered me a small, knowing smile. The sting of the mud on my shoes faded, replaced by a gritty, empowering satisfaction. We had survived their public arena without surrendering our dignity. But the victory felt fragile, like a brief truce in a war that was far from over. The social skirmishes at country clubs and equestrian events were exhausting, but they were ultimately a distraction. The real battle, the foundation of our entire future, was tied to a man who was running out of time. As the afternoon shadows lengthened over the Percy Warner grass, I checked my phone, hoping for an update from the medical facility. Harlan had been suffering quietly since the birthday dinner, and the fragile peace we secured in the bourbon tent was about to be obliterated by a medical emergency that would change the trajectory of our lives forever. The illusion of control is the first casualty in any real war. For 6 months, my father operated under the assumption that he held all the leverage. He dictated the rules of engagement, freezing my grants, isolating me socially, and weaponizing his vast network of influence. The stalemate dragged into the late autumn, chilling the Tennessee air. The oak trees dropped their leaves, turning the Nashville sidewalks brittle and brown. I settled into a rhythm of defensive endurance, drafting countless grant applications, while Leo expanded his nursery operations to cover our dwindling savings. We were surviving, but the psychological toll was immense. We both knew the quiet was unsustainable. The fragile peace shattered completely on a freezing Tuesday morning in early November. The phone rang at 4 a.m. It was not my father calling. It was a sympathetic night nurse at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. My grandfather, Harlan the Titan, who built a regional freight empire out of nothing, had suffered a catastrophic ischemic stroke. The blood supply to a critical area of his brain was severed, leaving the patriarch of the Beaumont family incapacitated. The nurse informed me that he was stabilized, but the prognosis was grim. She also mentioned in a lowered voice that my father had already instructed hospital security to deny my entrance if I attempted to visit the intensive care unit. The audacity of the ban hit me like a physical blow. Richard was using Harlan's medical emergency to assert total dominance, determining who was allowed to say goodbye to the man who built our legacy. I did not waste time arguing on the phone. I hung up, threw on a heavy coat, and drove the dark, quiet streets to the medical center. I did not walk through the main lobby. I knew the hospital layout from a preservation project I had completed years ago on an adjacent historical building. I navigated the labyrinth of underground tunnels and bypassed the front desk entirely using a service elevator designated for laundry and medical supplies. The stainless steel doors opened on the neurological intensive care floor. The corridor was silent, save for the rhythmic electronic beeping of medical monitors and the soft hum of the climate control system. I walked quickly past the nurse's station, keeping my head down. I found his room at the end of the hall. The heavy glass door was partially open. I stepped inside, and the breath caught in my throat. Harlan Beaumont, the man whose thunderous voice used to command boardrooms and silence unruly executives, looked terrifyingly small. He lay in the center of the sterile white bed, his skin pale and translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. A network of clear plastic tubes connected his failing body to towering machines tethering him to the earth. The rugged timber magnate who spent his life conquering the elements was now entirely vulnerable to them. My father was standing near the large window overlooking the dark city skyline. He did not look like a man grieving the imminent loss of his parent. He looked like a corporate tactician managing a crisis. He held his phone close to his mouth, aggressively whispering to a probate attorney. He was not discussing medical directives or end-of-life care. He was already outlining the legal strategy to freeze Harlan's generation-skipping trust the moment the monitors flatlined. He was preparing the battlefield while his father was still breathing. He did not hear me enter. I ignored his presence completely and walked to the side of the bed. I pulled a plastic chair close to the mattress and sat down, reaching out to grip Harlan's frail, age-spotted hand. His skin was cool to the touch, paper-thin, and lacking the robust, calloused strength I remembered from my childhood. I held his fingers gently, fighting the hot sting of tears pooling in my eyes. I did not want my father to see me cry. I wanted to project strength for the man who had defended my son at the country club dinner. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice cracking slightly despite my resolve, "I am here." Harlan's eyelids fluttered. The movement was slow, agonizingly deliberate. He opened his eyes. The left side of his face was slack, paralyzed by the lack of oxygen to his brain. But his eyes were terrifyingly alert. They carried a desperate, frantic urgency. He was trapped inside a failing vessel, screaming silently to be heard. He looked at me, and then his gaze darted toward the window where my father continued his hushed phone conversation, oblivious to the awakening. Harlan squeezed my fingers. The grip was shockingly firm given his condition. He did not let go. He pulled my hand weakly but insistently toward his chest, resting my palm against the rough cotton of his hospital gown. He could not form words. The stroke had stolen his speech, but it had not stolen his fierce mountain intellect. He maintained intense, unwavering eye contact with me. With a monumental, trembling effort, he lifted his index finger. He tapped twice against my knuckles, a clumsy, irregular rhythm that felt deliberate. He paused, breathing heavily, the monitor beside the bed accelerating its rhythmic beep. Then he pressed his finger firmly into my palm, dragging it slowly across my skin. He drew a straight line, then a second, and a third, creating a crude, jagged shape of a box. He stopped, exhausted, his hand falling back against the mattress. I stared down at my palm, my heart hammering against my ribs. A box. 2 taps. I leaned closer, my face inches from his. "What is it, Grandpa?" I asked softly, trying to decipher the final desperate transmission of a dying man. "Where is the box?" His eyes widened, the urgency escalating into a profound panic. He tried to raise his hand again, but the effort was too much. His chest heaved violently as he gasped for air. The sudden spike in his blood pressure triggered the monitor alarms. The high-pitched, shrill warning blared through the quiet room, slicing through the tension. My father spun away from the window, his phone dropping from his ear. He saw me sitting by the bed, and his face contorted in furious shock. "How did you get in here?" Richard demanded, taking a step toward me. "I told security to bar you." I did not answer him. The door swung open and a team of medical professionals rushed into the room. A doctor in blue scrubs pushed past my father, assessing the flashing monitors. "Secondary hemorrhage," the doctor shouted, barking orders to a nurse who was already preparing an injection. "We need to intubate immediately. Clear the room." A heavy-set orderly grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the bed. I fought the grip, trying to keep my eyes on Harlan, but the chaos was overwhelming. I was shoved backward out into the sterile hallway, the heavy glass door clicking shut in my face. My father was escorted out seconds later, his face flushed with anger. He glared at me, pointing an accusatory finger. "You upset him, Abigail. You should not be here." I did not have the energy to argue. I sank into a vinyl chair in the waiting area, staring at my open palm. The phantom sensation of my grandfather's trembling finger drawing that crude shape burned into my skin. 4 hours later, the lead physician walked out of the intensive care unit, his expression somber. He delivered the news with practiced, professional sympathy. Harlan Beaumont was gone. The Titan had fallen, leaving behind a massive corporate empire and a fractured family. My father did not weep. He nodded grimly, thanked the doctor, and immediately pulled his phone back out, dialing his legal team before Harlan's body was even cold. The Cold War was over. The physical anchor holding the Beaumont family together had snapped. The mourning period was a performative illusion, masking the brutal reality of what was about to happen. Harlan left me with a cryptic, fractured map drawn on my skin and an estate war that was about to rip our remaining civility to shreds. I walked out of the hospital into the freezing Nashville dawn, carrying the weight of a secret I did not yet understand. The true battle was not going to be fought in the hospital corridors. It was moving to the courts, and my father had spent months preparing an ambush I never saw coming. Highland Beaumont was buried on a Thursday under a gray, weeping Tennessee sky. The memorial service held at a historic stone sanctuary in Belmead was less a tribute to a grieving family and more a strategic networking event for the Southern elite. My mother wore a dark designer veil that shielded her eyes while she accepted polite condolences from bank presidents, local politicians, and real estate developers. My father delivered a eulogy perfectly tailored for public consumption. He painted a pristine picture of a loving patriarch and a unified family standing at a polished wooden pulpit. He spoke of generational legacy and duty, wiping a single, practiced tear from his cheek. Leo and I stood in the back row near the heavy sanctuary doors. I held our son tight against my chest, listening to the hollow words echoing off the vaulted, stained glass ceilings. The stark contrast between my father performing grief for an audience and the man who had frantically dialed his legal team before Harlan even took his last breath turned my stomach into a tight knot. We did not attend the catered reception at the country club. We drove back to our quiet craftsman home, bracing for the retaliation we knew was coming. The grace period lasted exactly 48 hours. Saturday morning brought a sharp, rhythmic knock at the front door. I answered it, holding a damp dish towel. A young man in a beige windbreaker asked me to verify my name. When I nodded, he handed me a thick, certified envelope, asked me to sign a digital pad, and walked back to his idling sedan without a single word. The return address, stamped in stark black ink, bore the official seal of the Davidson County Chancery Court. My hands felt numb as I carried the heavy package into the kitchen. Leo was out in the side yard repairing a cracked irrigation line, leaving me alone in the quiet house. I sat at the oak table and broke the adhesive seal. A 3-inch stack of dense legal documents slid out onto the wood. The cover page read, "Petition for will, contest, and injunctive relief." I poured a cup of black coffee, trying to steady my erratic breathing as I turned the pages. My father was officially challenging the validity of the irrevocable generation-skipping trust Harlan had executed at the birthday dinner. The initial claims were predictable. Richard alleged that my grandfather suffered from a lack of testamentary capacity, claiming the underlying stroke symptoms had been present for months, slowly degrading his cognitive function. He added a charge of undue influence, spinning a fabricated narrative that I had manipulated a vulnerable old man into disinheriting his only son to fund my husband and his failing agricultural business. It was a standard probate playbook, designed to create immediate doubt and freeze the financial assets. I took a sip of the bitter coffee, feeling a grim sense of validation. I knew he would fight the inheritance. I knew he would try to starve us out through litigation. But as I flipped to the secondary motion attached to the back of the binder, the air left my lungs. The bold header read, "Emergency Petition for Guardianship of Estate and Removal of Fiduciary." I read the paragraphs that followed, and a cold, terrifying dread settled deep into my bones, replacing the blood in my veins with ice water. Richard was not merely fighting for his share of the timber fortune. He was attempting to remove me as the trustee for my son and his new inheritance. To achieve that under Tennessee law, he had to prove I was legally unfit to manage the estate. Attached as Exhibit D were 20 pages of my own confidential medical records from the previous year. They were clinical notes from my obstetrician and a licensed therapist, detailing a severe, grueling battle with postpartum depression. The documents chronicled my sleepless nights, my terrifying intrusive thoughts, and the medication I was prescribed to survive those dark, vulnerable months after my son was born. My father had somehow bypassed basic privacy protections, leveraging his corporate influence, or finding a sympathetic local judge to subpoena my most private, agonizing struggle. He presented my mental health history to the court as proof of profound instability. His high-priced lawyers argued that a woman who could barely function after childbirth was legally incompetent to manage a multi-million-dollar trust. He was weaponizing the hardest season of my life, twisting my recovery into a narrative of permanent madness to seize control of my child and his future. I dropped the papers on the table. A wave of nausea washed over me, forcing me to grip the edge of the wood to keep from falling out of the chair. He had stripped away my privacy, leaving my deepest insecurities exposed on the public court record for any clerk or judge to read. This was no longer just a dispute over money or country club pride. This was a declaration of total war. By attacking my fitness as a mother, he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I grabbed my phone and called a local probate attorney recommended by a former preservation colleague. I drove to his office in downtown Nashville later that afternoon. The consultation was brief, sterile, and devastating. The lawyer sat behind a large mahogany desk, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the Chancery Court filings. He explained that the judge had already granted the emergency injunction freezing Harlan's entire estate, pending a full investigation into my mental health and the undue influence claims. The generation-skipping trust was locked tight. We could not access a single dime to defend ourselves. The attorney laid out the harsh reality of the Tennessee legal system. Probate litigation in this state moves with agonizing slowness. Unwinding a complex medical privacy violation and fighting a well-funded will contest would require at least 14 months of grueling legal discovery depositions and motion hearings. The initial retainer fee to simply file a response would drain the last few $1,000s Leo and I had scraped together from selling the nursery equipment. The lawyer warned me that my father had deep pockets and a clear strategy of attrition. He intended to bleed us dry until we could no longer afford legal representation, forcing a default judgment. The trap had closed with flawless precision. My father had locked me in a courtroom cage, calculating that I would run out of funds and emotional endurance long before a judge ever heard my actual testimony. I walked out of the law office and into the humid Nashville evening, feeling a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I was broke, publicly humiliated, and legally painted as an unstable mother incapable of caring for her own family. The sheer terror of losing control over my son and his trust overshadowed every rational thought I possessed. I drove home in a daze, the streetlights blurring through the windshield. The financial strain, the medical exposure, and the betrayal by my own blood were pushing my nervous system to the absolute breaking point. I spent the weekend pacing the floorboards of our house, jumping at every shadow and second-guessing every parenting decision I made, while my father sat comfortably in his Belmead fortress. The relentless psychological pressure demanded an outlet. I was trying to hold together a crumbling world while pretending I was strong enough to fight a billionaire. In the dark, isolated hours of the following week, that mounting pressure would force me into a humiliating surrender, giving my father the exact ammunition he needed to secure his final victory. The machinery of the legal system is built to crush those who cannot afford to keep it running. 3 months after my father filed the emergency injunction, our financial reality collapsed into basic, grueling survival. The initial retainer for our probate attorney had drained our checking account completely, leaving us with a staggering negative balance on our primary credit card. The legal fees continued to accrue at a sickening pace, with every motion drafted and every email answered, adding hundreds of dollars to a debt we could not pay. We cut every conceivable expense. We stopped buying fresh produce and lived almost entirely on dried beans and bulk rice. We canceled our internet service and relied on my phone data to communicate with our lawyer. When November shifted into December, the temperature in Nashville dropped significantly, plunging the city into a bitter, wet freeze. The central heating unit in our Craftsman home failed loudly on a Tuesday night, emitting a final mechanical screech before going dead. The HVAC technician quoted $800 just to source the replacement part. I thanked him for his time and politely showed him the door, wrapping myself in 2 thick sweaters. We spent our evenings huddled in the living room, keeping the baby close to a small electric space heater while the rest of the house grew painfully cold. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological terror that consumed my every waking thought. The fear of losing my son and his future inheritance to a man who viewed him as a genetic stain sat heavy on my chest, making it nearly impossible to draw a full breath. I was crumbling under the weight of an invisible siege. Healing is never linear. It rarely looks like a clean, brave exit from the people who hurt you. Have you ever broken your own no-contact rule in a moment of extreme weakness? Tell me your story in the comments, because navigating the messy reality of trauma is something we rarely talk about honestly. It happened on a Thursday evening in late January. The wind howled against the single-pane windows, rattling the glass in its wooden frames. The house felt exceptionally large and terribly empty. Leo had taken his truck out into the freezing rain to deliver a late seed order to a commercial farm in Murfreesboro, hoping to scrape together enough cash to cover our overdue utility bill. He left around 7, promising to drive carefully on the slick roads. I put the baby to sleep in the nursery, ensuring the space heater was positioned safely near his crib before walking down to the dark kitchen. The chill seeped up through the floorboards, biting into my socks. I opened a cabinet near the sink looking for a clean mug to pour some tap water. Sitting in the very back, hidden behind a stack of mismatched dinner plates, was a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon someone had left at our house over a year ago. I stared at the amber liquid catching the faint light from the street lamp outside. I had not touched a drop of alcohol since discovering I was pregnant. I prided myself on my discipline, my ability to stay sharp and vigilant while my parents waged their shadow war. But the exhaustion in my bones felt terminal. I wanted 10 minutes of relief. I wanted to turn the anxiety off just long enough to stop analyzing legal jargon and counting the exact number of days until our next court filing. I unscrewed the cap. I did not bother grabbing a glass. I sat down on the cold linoleum floor, leaning my back against the lower cabinets, and took a long, fast drink straight from the bottle. The cheap bourbon burned a harsh, jagged path down my throat, hitting my empty stomach with a sudden, violent warmth. It tasted like ash and cheap oak, but it worked quickly. I took another deep swallow, letting the intoxicating fog roll into my brain. I expected the alcohol to numb the pain. I expected it to grant me a brief, temporary reprieve from the crushing pressure of the estate dispute. Instead, the liquor bypassed my logic entirely and dissolved the thick protective armor I had spent months painstakingly building. The stoic defiance, the righteous anger, the fierce maternal instinct protecting my son, all evaporated. What remained underneath was a profound, agonizing loneliness. I sat on the kitchen floor, staring at my phone resting on the counter above me. The house was so quiet. My husband was out risking his life on icy roads to pay a light bill, while the people who raised me sat in an opulent, heated mansion, deliberately orchestrating my starvation. I thought about the holidays I used to spend decorating the tree with my father. I remembered how safe I felt when he used to carry me on his shoulders before I ever knew what conditional love meant. The bourbon twisted those memories, amplifying my grief until it became unbearable. I just wanted it all to stop. I did not want to fight a billionaire in Chancery Court anymore. I did not want to be the scapegoat. I wanted my dad. In a state of pathetic, drunken vulnerability, I reached up and pulled my phone down from the counter. I opened my contacts and stared at my father name. I knew the rules. My lawyer had explicitly instructed me never to contact Richard Beaumont directly. Any communication had to flow through official legal channels to prevent misinterpretation or manipulation. But the bourbon convinced me that a daughter calling her father could cut through the corporate warfare. I hit the call button. The line rang 3 times, echoing loudly in the quiet kitchen. The digital voice of his automated answering service filled the silence. He was probably sitting in his study screening his calls. A sharp beep signaled the start of the recording. I opened my mouth, intending to ask him for a truce, to appeal to whatever tiny fraction of paternal love still existed inside him. I did not yell. I did not demand justice for the genetic testing or the stolen grants. I broke down completely. A loud, ugly sob tore out of my throat, vibrating through the phone speaker. "Dad, please," I wept, my voice slurring heavily, barely recognizable as my own. "Just stop doing this. Please stop the lawsuits. I am so tired. The house is freezing and we do not have any money left. I miss you. I miss my dad. I just want our family back. Why do you hate us so much? Just make it stop. I beg you." I babbled for 2 agonizing minutes, crying openly into the receiver, regressing into a frightened 12-year-old girl, desperate for her father approval. I abandoned every shred of dignity I possessed, pleading with my abuser to show mercy. When the automated system finally cut me off, reaching the maximum recording length, the phone slipped from my grasp, clattering against the linoleum. I slumped down against the cabinet, letting the tears soak my sweater, until the exhaustion finally pulled me into a heavy, dreamless sleep right there on the kitchen floor. The blinding glare of the winter sun streaming through the window woke me the next morning. My head throbbed with a vicious, relentless pounding, and my mouth tasted like dry cotton. I sat up groaning as the stiffness in my neck protested. Leo was standing near the stove, brewing coffee in an old French press. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, not asking why I had slept on the floor. I stood up, gripping the edge of the counter to steady my trembling legs. My eyes fell on the empty bourbon bottle resting near the sink, and the memory of the previous night crashed down on me with sickening clarity. I grabbed my phone, unlocking the screen with frantic, fumbling fingers. I checked my recent call log, hoping the whiskey had just given me a very bad dream. The screen displayed a confirmed 2-minute outgoing call to Richard Beaumont, time-stamped at 11:40 the night prior. The air rushed out of my lungs, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. I had not just broken a no-contact rule. I had willingly handed the opposing counsel a recorded audio file, proving I was currently an emotional wreck. I gave my father raw, unedited evidence that he was successfully breaking my spirit. I walked to the bathroom, gripping the edges of the porcelain sink, and threw up everything left in my stomach. The humiliating mistake was irreversible, and my father was about to use it to publicly execute my character in a room full of lawyers. The Davidson County Chancery Court moves at the pace of a glacier, grinding down everything in its path with slow, agonizing precision. For months, I existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the official legal proceedings to begin. The discovery phase, the period where both sides exchange evidence and conduct formal interviews, is designed to exhaust the opposing party before they ever see a judge. It strips away your privacy, laying your entire life bare on a polished mahogany table. My official deposition was scheduled for a bleak Tuesday morning in late February. I drove to a towering glass skyscraper in downtown Nashville, the kind of building that housed men who viewed the law not as an instrument of justice, but as a weapon of attrition. My attorney, a pragmatic man named Davis, warned me the night before to stay calm. He told me the opposing counsel would attempt to rattle my cage, to provoke an outburst they could enter into the official court record. I nodded and promised to remain stoic, believing I had fortified my mind against their tactics. I was spectacularly wrong. The deposition took place in a sterile, windowless conference room on the 32nd floor. The air conditioning was set uncomfortably low, a deliberate choice to keep the environment hostile. A court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers resting lightly on a stenotype machine, ready to transcribe every syllable spoken. I sat next to Davis, staring across the wide table at my father, lead litigator. His name was Vance, a ruthless corporate bulldog wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He specialized in psychological pressure, dismantling witnesses with the cold, detached efficiency of a surgeon. My father, Richard Beaumont, sat at the far end of the table. He wore a crisp navy blazer, his posture immaculate. He did not look at me directly, keeping his gaze fixed on a legal pad in front of him. He was playing the role of the reluctant patriarch forced into litigation by an unstable daughter. For 5 grueling hours, Vance interrogated my entire existence. He did not ask questions to discover the truth. He asked questions to construct a trap. He grilled me on the specific zoning violations that shut down my Appalachian Preservation Initiative, painting my sudden lack of funding not as a result of my Mother Foundation freezing the grants, but as proof of my own professional incompetence. He pivoted seamlessly to my marriage, probing the financial instability of Leo Heirloom Seed Nursery, suggesting my husband was a grifter, leeching off the Beaumont wealth. He weaponized my confidential medical records, reading excerpts from my postpartum depression therapy notes aloud. He forced me to verify under oath the exact dosages of the medication I took to survive those dark months, twisting my recovery into a narrative of permanent madness. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. My jaw ached from clenching my teeth. My fingernails dug into the palms of my hands, leaving deep red crescents in the skin. I maintained a shaky composure, answering his relentless barrage with tight, measured sentences exactly as Davis had instructed. I thought I had survived the worst of the onslaught. Then Vance reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small, black digital voice recorder. He set it gently on the center of the table, the plastic casing clicking against the polished wood. "I would like to enter Exhibit J into the record," Vance announced, his voice smooth and devoid of any cold, terrifying dread spiked through my chest. I looked at my father. He finally raised his head, meeting my gaze. His expression was a masterpiece of manufactured, pitying concern. He looked like a man deeply worried about the safety of a broken child. It was a flawless performance for the court reporter. Vance pressed the play button on the device, the quiet conference room filled with the unmistakable sound of my own voice. The audio was slightly distorted, but the slurred, heavy desperation was crystal clear. "Dad, please just stop doing this. Please stop the lawsuits. I am so tired. The house is freezing and we do not have any money left. I miss you. I miss my dad. I just want our family back. Why do you hate us so much?" The pathetic weeping regression into childhood subservience echoed off the acoustic wall panels. I closed my eyes, physically sickened by the sound of my own humiliation. I listened to myself beg my abuser for mercy, handing him the exact ammunition he needed to prove I was unfit to manage my son's inheritance. When the recording finally ended, leaving a heavy, loaded silence in its wake, I felt stripped bare. My stoicism was a joke. I had exposed my weakest, most vulnerable underbelly to a room full of predators. Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He steepled his fingers together, looking at me with an expression of thinly veiled disgust. "Tell me, Abigail," he sneered, lowering his voice to a dangerous, patronizing register. "The woman crying on that recording sounds incredibly confused and highly intoxicated. Is it not true that you manipulate elderly men to secure their fortunes just as easily as you manipulate alcohol to cope with your obvious failures?" The question was not designed to seek an answer. It was designed to detonate the pressure cooker. And it worked flawlessly. Logic abandoned my brain entirely. The months of starvation, the public humiliation, the theft of my son's genetic privacy, the freezing nights in my house, all collided in a single white-hot flash of blinding rage. The levees holding back my anger did not just crack. They vaporized. I stood up, The movement was so sudden and violent that my heavy leather chair crashed backward against the wall, slamming into the drywall with a loud, definitive thud. Davis grabbed my arm, attempting to pull me back down, whispering my name in a frantic warning. I ripped my arm out of his grasp. I did not care about the court reporter. I did not care about the official transcript. I only cared about destroying the smug, arrogant smirk on Vance's face. I reached down and grabbed the heavy 3-inch D-ring binder containing the deposition exhibits resting in front of me. I lifted it high above my head, the metal rings groaning under the weight of the paper, and hurled it across the table with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The binder flew through the air, resembling a clumsy, heavy projectile. It slammed directly into Vance's crystal water glass. The glass exploded on impact, sending a shower of water and sharp shards raining down over his expensive suit and his pristine legal pads. "You piece of filth," I screamed, my voice raw and completely unhinged, stripping away every layer of Belmead etiquette I was raised to uphold. "You sit there in your custom suit, judging my survival, while you actively help a coward steal from a baby. You think a drunken voicemail proves I am unstable? You have no idea what instability looks like. You are all pathetic leeches trying to scrub the dirt off a name that was built in the mud. I will burn this entire legacy to the ground before I let you touch my son." I cursed at them, delivering a venomous string of profanities that would make a construction worker blush. I stood, chest heaving, staring down the men who had orchestrated my ruin. Vance brushed the water off his lapel, his face tight with anger, but a dark, triumphant glint sparked in his eyes. My father sat motionless, staring at the shattered glass on the table, hiding a very subtle, satisfied smile. "Miss Beaumont," Vance said, his voice dripping with icy finality, "the deposition is concluded. I believe we have everything we need for the judge." Davis packed his briefcase in frantic silence, refusing to look at me. I turned on my heel and marched out of the conference room, the adrenaline pumping through my veins like battery acid. The elevator ride down to the lobby was agonizingly slow. I stared at the metal doors, the fiery rage beginning to cool, leaving behind a stark, terrifying clarity. I had lost control. I had thrown a physical object in a room full of opposing lawyers. I had cursed aggressively on the official court record, permanently etching my meltdown into a transcript the judge would inevitably read. I had just provided the exact, documented proof my father needed to validate his emergency injunction and seize control of the trust. I walked out onto the bustling Nashville sidewalk, the cold February wind hitting my flushed face, knowing I had likely just cost my son his entire future. The legal strategy was ruined, and I had no idea how to pull us out of the wreckage I created. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper, trembling so hard my knees felt like they might give way. The freezing February wind whipped through the downtown concrete canyons, slicing through my thin wool coat. But I barely registered the cold. The adrenaline crash hit me before I even reached the crosswalk, leaving a hollow, sickening void in my stomach. I was convinced I had just handed my son his entire future over to a man who despised him. I scanned the bustling street corner looking for my husband. Leo was waiting idling by the curb in his rusted Ford pickup truck. The engine gave a low, unsteady rumble, a stark contrast to the silent, luxury sedans gliding past us. I pulled the heavy passenger door open and climbed up onto the cracked leather bench seat. Leo took one look at my flushed face, the streaks of ruined makeup tracking down my cheeks, and the rigid terror locked in my jaw. He did not ask how the deposition went. He read the disaster written all over my posture. He shifted the truck into gear and merged into the heavy midday traffic, driving us away from the polished high-rises and the men in custom suits who had just dismantled my life. I assumed we were going home. I wanted to crawl into my bed, pull the heavy quilts over my head, and hide from the reality of my catastrophic failure. I needed the quiet isolation of our craftsman house to nurse my self-pity. But Leo did not turn toward East Nashville. He steered the truck south, navigating through the industrial corridors and neglected side streets where the pristine illusion of Belle Meade faded into the grit of the working class. He pulled the truck into a crowded gravel parking lot outside Arnold Country Kitchen. It was a bustling, unpretentious meat-and-three diner housed in a plain cinder block building. It was a legendary Nashville institution, a place where the pretense of high society vanished entirely. The parking lot was packed with utility vans, commercial plumbing trucks, and dusty sedans. Leo killed the engine. I looked at him, confused by the detour. I could not fathom sitting in a public restaurant right now. My hands were still shaking from hurling that binder. "Come on, Abby," he set his tone, leaving no room for argument. "You need to eat, and we need to talk somewhere that does not feel like a funeral." I followed him inside. The bell above the door chimed, announcing our arrival. The diner was a sensory overload of authentic local culture. The air was thick and heavy, smelling intensely of fried chicken, slow-cooked collard greens, and rich brown gravy. The noise level was a chaotic, comforting roar of clattering silverware scraping against thick ceramic plates and loud, uninhibited conversation. We grabbed red plastic trays and moved down the cafeteria-style line. I barely looked at the food, pointing blindly at a scoop of macaroni and cheese, while Leo ordered enough roast beef and cornbread to feed a field crew. We found an empty red vinyl booth in the back corner. The table was worn smooth by decades of elbows, and the vinyl seat squeaked under my weight. I sat across from Leo, surrounded by men in neon high-visibility vests, mechanics with grease-stained hands, and local factory workers enjoying their lunch break. It was a room filled with people who knew exactly what a hard day of labor felt like. I slumped forward, resting my elbows on the sticky table, and buried my face in my hands. The tears I had fought back in the truck finally breached the surface. I wept quietly, hiding my face from the crowded room, waiting for my husband to offer the comfort I desperately craved. I expected him to reach across the table, rub my arms, and tell me that things would eventually work out. I wanted him to coddle me, to assure me that throwing the binder was a justified reaction to a cruel lawyer. I needed him to validate my victimhood. He did not do any of those things. I heard the heavy thud of Leo setting his iced tea glass down on the table. He did not offer a soft, sympathetic murmur. He spoke with a firm, unwavering clarity that cut through the noise of the diner and the static of my own panic. "You threw a binder, Abby," Leo said. His voice was wholly devoid of pity. I pulled my hands away from my face, blinking through the wet blur of my tears. I looked at him, shocked by the cold pragmatism in his tone. He was sitting up straight, his broad shoulders squared, looking at me not as a fragile wife, but as a partner failing her end of the bargain. I could not help it. I stammered, a defensive edge creeping into my voice. "They played that voicemail, Leo. They played the recording of me crying on the kitchen floor. They sat there and mocked me. They called me a drunk who manipulates old men. You do not understand the pressure they put on me in that room." Leo picked up a cornbread muffin, breaking it in half. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed, and that hurt far worse than any insult my father lawyer could have hurled. "I understand exactly what they did," Leo replied, leaning forward over the table. "They set a trap. They needed to prove to a judge that you are an unstable, emotional wreck who cannot handle the responsibility of a generation-skipping trust. And you gave them the exact performance they ordered. You played their game, Abby, and you lost." The words felt like a slap. I recoiled, pulling my arms off the table. I felt a surge of defensive resentment. I wanted to remind him that I was fighting a billionaire. I wanted to remind him of the starvation tactics my parents had deployed against us. But before I could form the words, Leo kept talking, dismantling my excuses with brutal precision. "You are trying to fight a war using the rules your father taught you," Leo continued, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "You grew up in Belmead. You learned how to be polite, how to trade passive remarks at country clubs, how to care about optics. The Beaumonts win when you act like a fragile aristocrat. They want you to care about the official court transcript. They want you to panic when they shatter your polite facade." He reached across the table, his hand wrapped around my wrist. His skin was rough, the knuckles scarred from repairing engines and turning the tough Greene County soil. He did not offer a gentle caress. He offered a grounding iron grip. "You have to stop fighting them like a Belmead socialite," Leo commanded. "You have to start fighting them like someone who knows how to survive the dirt." I stared at him, the defensive walls in my mind crumbling under the weight of his logic. The tears stopped. The stifling panic that had choked me since the deposition began to recede, replaced by a stark, abrasive clarity. "My family survived the coal camps in East Tennessee," Leo said, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "We survived mine collapses and company stores that starved us out. Your grandfather Harlan survived the hollers. He did not build a timber empire by throwing tantrums when some rich lawyer insulted him. He built it by finding the weak spot in the foundation and bringing the whole structure down." He let go of my wrist, picking up his fork. "Stop crying over a broken glass," Leo told me, pointing the utensil at my plate. "Eat your food. Then we are going to figure out what your father is actually afraid of. The elite only use theatrical pressure when they are hiding a structural flaw. You need to find the leverage, Abby. Stop reacting and start digging." It was the exact abrasive shock my system desperately required. The coddling I had wanted would have kept me paralyzed in my own misery. Leo breaking my victimhood saved me. He was right. I had spent months playing defense, reacting to every legal motion and financial block my father initiated. I was letting them dictate the battlefield. I picked up my fork and took a bite of the macaroni and cheese. It tasted like ash in my dry mouth, but I forced myself to swallow it. I needed the energy. I needed to shift my perspective from the polished high-rises to the unsterilized earth. If my father was terrified of Harlan's true legacy of the dirt and the holler, then that was exactly where I needed to look. I sat in the noisy diner, the smell of fried chicken and grease surrounding me, and let my mind drift backward. I thought about the days leading up to the funeral. I thought about the cold, sterile hospital room and the frantic, desperate energy in my grandfather's eyes before he died. A memory flickered in the dark recesses of my brain. I remembered Harlan gripping my hand, his breathing ragged and uneven. I remembered the 2 clumsy taps against my knuckles and the crude shape his trembling finger had traced across my palm. At the time, I thought it was just the random firing of a dying brain. But sitting in Arnold Country Kitchen looking at my husband's soil-stained hands, the memory sharpened into focus. It was not a random shape. It was a blueprint, and the realization of what it actually meant sent a jolt of pure electric adrenaline straight through my spine. The mind has a strange way of guarding its own secrets, unlocking them only when the necessity for survival overrides the trauma of the moment. Leo's abrasive reality check in the diner shattered my victimhood, clearing the psychological fog that had kept me paralyzed since the deposition. I went home that evening not to rest, but to work. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a mug of black coffee, staring blankly at the rough grain of the wood. I spent 3 sleepless nights dissecting the final, agonizing moments in the intensive care unit. I replayed the sequence endlessly in my mind. The sterile white room, the rhythmic shrill beep of the monitors, my father pacing by the window whispering his legal strategies into his phone. And Harlan, the titan of the timber industry, utilizing the last fraction of his dying strength to grab my hand. He had tapped my knuckles twice, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Then he had dragged his trembling finger across my palm, drawing a straight line, followed by a second and a third, completing a crude, jagged box. For months I had assumed it was the frantic misfiring of a brain deprived of oxygen. Later, when the litigation began, I briefly wondered if he was trying to indicate a safety deposit box or a hidden bank vault, but that logic never held. A billionaire like Harlan Beaumont did not hide his leverage in a commercial bank where my father corporate lawyers could easily subpoena it. Harlan was a man born in the dirt. He trusted the earth far more than he trusted a bank vault. The answers to our biggest problems are usually sitting right in front of us, buried beneath layers of history we are too afraid to dig up. What is the most shocking family secret you have ever uncovered? Drop your story in the comments below, because the truth rarely stays buried forever. It hit me at 2 a.m. on the 4th night. The realization struck with the blunt, concussive force of a freight train. The shape he drew on my palm was not a generic square. The lines were uneven, intentionally asymmetrical. It was a specific architectural footprint. 2 taps on the knuckles, 2 knocks. He was not drawing a vault. He was drawing the exact asymmetrical floor plan of the 1890s Appalachian smokehouse I had been restoring in Cheatham County. The very same preservation project my mother philanthropic foundation had aggressively defunded to starve me into submission. Harlan had visited the site with me nearly a year ago. He had walked through the crumbling structure, running his hands over the charred hickory beams, asking me detailed questions about the foundation. I had shown him the unique architectural anomaly, a false floorboard I had mapped out during my initial structural survey. The 2 taps on my hand were the signal, 2 knocks on the false board. He was telling me exactly where he hid the real legacy. I ran into the bedroom and shook Leo awake. I did not bother explaining the theory. I just told him to grab his heavy Maglite flashlights and a crowbar. We left the baby sleeping soundly in his crib under the watchful eye of a trusted neighbor we called in an emergency and drove out into the freezing Tennessee night. The rural property in Cheatham County was completely isolated, located miles down an unpaved logging road. We parked the rusted truck near the tree line, the headlights cutting through the dense, overgrown brush. The winter air was sharp and biting, carrying the distinct metallic scent of impending frost. We navigated the uneven terrain, our heavy boots crunching over the dead foliage. The skeletal frame of the smokehouse loomed out of the darkness, resembling a giant, decaying ribcage against the night sky. The city inspectors had condemned the site weeks ago, wrapping it in cheap yellow caution tape that fluttered weakly in the wind. We ducked under the tape and stepped inside the structure. The air inside was trapped and stale, smelling intensely of ancient charred hickory and undisturbed dust. The beams creaked ominously, groaning under the weight of the sagging roof. I did not waste time examining the structural integrity. I turned my flashlight toward the back corner, illuminating the uneven dirt floor. I counted the heavy oak planks moving past the main supports. I found the specific section I had mapped out during my survey. Here, I whispered my voice barely audible over the wind. 2 planks from the back wall. Leo stepped forward, the heavy iron crowbar gripped firmly in his calloused hands. He wedged the curved end of the tool into the narrow gap between the rotting oak boards. He threw his weight backward, using his shoulder as leverage. The ancient nails shrieked a high-pitched grating sound as the rusted iron protested against the wood. The plank gave way, snapping upward with a loud crack. Leo tossed the broken wood aside and knelt in the dirt. He dug his hands into the freezing earth, clearing away decades of compacted topsoil and debris. His fingers struck something hard and metallic. He dug faster, pulling up a heavy rectangular object wrapped tightly in thick layers of dark oilcloth. We hauled it out of the dirt and carried it back to the truck, resting it on the rusted metal of the tailgate. My hands were shaking as I pulled away the layers of stiff, brittle cloth. Beneath the wrapping sat a heavy, sealed iron lockbox. It was old, the metal pitted and scarred by time, but the heavy brass padlock securing the latch was pristine. Harlan had not hidden this box recently. He had prepared this failsafe years, perhaps decades ago, understanding that the corporate empire he built would eventually try to erase the history he actually valued. Leo did not ask for a key. He raised the crowbar and brought it down violently against the brass padlock. The metal shattered on the third strike, the latch springing open with a sharp click. I reached forward and pushed the heavy iron lid back. The smell of aged paper leather and dry tobacco drifted up from the box. There were no stock certificates inside. There were no bearer bonds or offshore bank account numbers. The box contained a stack of thick, bound leather journals. Beneath the journals lay a bundle of brittle, yellowed paper held together by a fraying twine string. I carefully picked up the bundle, untying the knot. They were original land deeds dating back to the 1920s, detailing property ownership deep in the hollers of Greene County. Next to the deeds sat a stack of handwritten letters, the ink faded to a pale brown. The letters were correspondence between Harlan and his mother, detailing the grueling survival of the coal camps and the fierce, unyielding pride of the mountain people my father had spent his entire life trying to scrub from our lineage. I opened the top leather journal, holding the flashlight steady. The pages were filled with Harlan, precise, meticulous handwriting. I started reading the entries, the dates moving chronologically through the decades. The words on the page completely dismantled the narrative my father had constructed for the Chancery Court. My father had built his entire legal strategy on the premise that Harlan was a confused, manipulated old man suffering from cognitive decline, incapable of making a rational decision regarding the Generation Skipping Trust. The journals proved the exact opposite. They were not the ramblings of a failing mind. They were a razor-sharp shadow ledger detailing a secret financial life Harlan had maintained for over 40 years. The unsterilized, unedited truth of Harlan Beaumont's life was sitting on the tailgate of a rusted pickup truck, and it held the absolute power to destroy my father's entire legal strategy. I closed the journal, the leather cool against my palm. We had found the leverage, and we were going to bring the heavy iron directly into the courtroom. We carried the iron lockbox into the house just as the first pale streaks of dawn began to bleed through the kitchen windows. The adrenaline that fueled our midnight excavation in Cheatham County settled into a sharp, cold focus. I wiped the mud from the oilcloth and spread the contents across the oak table. Leo brewed a pot of strong black coffee, the bitter scent cutting through the lingering smell of charred hickory dust that clung to our clothes. I opened the top leather journal, tracing my fingers over the cracked binding. The narrative my father had spun in the Davidson County Chancery Court was built on a very specific foundation. He claimed Harlan was a confused, manipulated old man suffering from severe cognitive decline in his final years. My father needed the judge to believe that my grandfather lacked the mental capacity to execute a complex generation-skipping trust, and that I had used his vulnerability to orchestrate the inheritance. The pages resting under my hands proved the exact opposite. They were not the scattered ramblings of a failing mind. They contained a razor-sharp, meticulous shadow ledger. Harlan had maintained a secondary financial empire that my father knew nothing about. For 40 years, while Richard paraded around the Belmead Country Club, obsessed with accumulating social capital and polishing his aristocratic facade, Harlan had been quietly funneling anonymous microloans to the working-class backbone of East Tennessee. I turned the pages, reading the detailed accounting of his silent philanthropy. He had saved a family-owned sawmill in Washington County from bankruptcy during a recession. He provided zero-interest capital to struggling diesel mechanics in Morristown. He backed independent agricultural cooperatives in Greenville, ensuring that the farmers who worked the tough mountain soil could keep their land. Harlan was actively preserving the rugged, unpolished world my father loathed. He was subsidizing the very heritage Leo represented. The timber magnate who wore bespoke suits in Nashville had never actually left the holler in his heart. He used his immense wealth to protect the dirt he came from. The ledgers contained detailed calculations, risk assessments, and compound interest projections that would rival any corporate accountant. It was undeniable documented proof of a brilliant, lucid mind operating at peak capacity until the very end. But the financial records were just the armor. The weapon was located near the end of the final journal. I turned to a page dated exactly 3 days before the infamous birthday dinner. 3 days before my father stole my son's pacifier to run his secret DNA test. Harlan had penned a long, dense entry detailing his profound disgust with the man his son had become. The ink pressed hard into the paper, revealing his simmering frustration. Harlan wrote about Richard's obsession with pedigree and the toxic, sterile fortress he had built around our family. He described watching Richard sneer at a waiter earlier that week and realized that the Beaumont legacy was rotting from the inside out. The final paragraph of the entry made my breath catch in my throat. Harlan explicitly outlined his deliberate, premeditated intent to bypass Richard in the will. He detailed his plan to utilize a generation-skipping trust to funnel the estate directly to my child, ensuring the wealth bypassed the country club entirely. This entry obliterated my father undue influence claim. I had not manipulated Harlan at the dinner table. Harlan had walked into that private dining room with his mind already made up, waiting for the right moment to execute his plan. My father's cruel DNA presentation had merely been the catalyst that forced Harlan to pull the trigger publicly. I closed the journal, the worn leather slapping softly against the table. I looked at Leo, sitting across from me holding his coffee mug. I did not want to hand these books over to Davis, my expensive, cautious probate attorney in Nashville. Davis was a man who played by the established rules of Chancery Court. He would file polite motions requesting a summary judgment. He would attempt to negotiate a civilized settlement. I did not want a settlement. I wanted an execution. The time for polite defense was over. We needed to go on the offensive. Leo knew exactly who we needed. We drove east the next morning, leaving the polished high-rises of Nashville behind and heading toward the rolling foothills of Greenville. Leo introduced me to an independent litigator named Silas. Silas did not operate out of a glass skyscraper. His office was located above a hardware store smelling of stale cigarette smoke and old paper. He wore a rumpled corduroy suit and kept a jar of salted peanuts on his cluttered desk. But beneath the unpolished exterior was a brilliant legal predator who treated courtrooms like bar brawls. Silas despised the old money elite of Middle Tennessee. When I dropped the leather journals on his desk and explained the situation, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his weathered face. He did not talk about negotiating. He talked about laying a trap so deep my father would never see the bottom. We spent a grueling week in that cramped office building, an inescapable legal snare. Silas combed through the Tennessee rules of civil procedure, finding a specific tactical loophole that would allow us to introduce the journals not during the sluggish months of standard discovery, but directly into evidence during the upcoming emergency injunction hearing. We were going to blindside my father, lead litigator. We cross-referenced every date in the shadow ledger with Harlan official banking records, verifying the flow of funds to make the evidence bulletproof. Silas coached me on how to sit, how to breathe, and how to look at the judge when the bomb finally dropped. He stripped away the fragile socialite persona my parents had ingrained in me and replaced it with cold, gritty endurance. The morning of the Chancery Court showdown arrived with a heavy, humid overcast. I stood in my kitchen preparing to leave. I did not pack a sleek designer briefcase. I grabbed a heavy, durable canvas tote bag. I carefully placed the leather journals wrapped in protective plastic inside the canvas. Then I walked over to the stove, Resting on the burner was a heavy, seasoned lodge cast-iron skillet. It was an antique, forged in South Pittsburgh, Tennessee, passed down from Leo's grandmother. It was pitch black, scarred by decades of open flames and countless family meals. It represented permanence, weight, and the undeniable strength of the mountain people. I picked up the cold, heavy iron skillet and slid it into the tote bag, right next to the journals. It was not a weapon, it was a physical anchor. I wanted the undeniable weight of Leo heritage pulling at my shoulder every time I took a step toward the courtroom. I wanted a tangible reminder of the strategy we were employing. My father and his high-priced lawyers operated in a world of fine china, delicate porcelain, and fragile reputations. They broke things by tapping them lightly in the right places. But cast iron does not shatter when you drop it. It breaks the floor underneath. I slung the heavy canvas strap over my shoulder, feeling the satisfying, unyielding weight pressing against my side. Leo met me at the front door, wearing a simple dark suit, his calloused hands resting easily at his sides. He looked at the bulging tote bag and offered a single, approving nod. The grueling months of starvation, the public humiliation at the Steeplechase, the agonizing deposition where I had surrendered my dignity, they all evaporated in the face of what we were about to do. We walked out to the truck, the gravel crunching beneath our boots. The delicate porcelain era of my life was officially over. We were bringing heavy iron to the courtroom, and the Beaumont aristocratic fortress was about to face a wrecking ball it could never survive. The Davidson County Chancery Court resides in a historic building downtown, wrapped in imposing limestone and heavy bronze doors. Part 3 of the Chancery Court, where complex probate injunctions are dissected and ruled upon, smelled distinctly of lemon polish, stale paper, and old varnished wood. The gallery was empty, save for a few bored law clerks. This was not a jury trial. This was a bench hearing, an intimate, high-stakes arena where a single magistrate held the absolute power to determine the trajectory of my son's future. I walked down the center aisle, the heavy canvas tote bag pressing against my hip. The cast-iron skillet resting inside bumped against my thigh with every step, providing a steady, rhythmic anchor. Leo walked beside me, projecting a quiet, immovable strength that seemed to absorb the nervous energy vibrating in the room. My father sat at the petitioner table, positioned near the front of the courtroom. Richard Beaumont wore a pristine charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He projected an aura of bored inevitability, leaning back in his heavy leather chair while his lead litigator, Vance, organized stacks of pristine legal folders. My father did not look anxious. He looked like a man waiting for a foregone conclusion. He assumed my catastrophic meltdown during the deposition, hurling the binder and cursing at his lawyer, had already secured his victory. He believed he had successfully painted me as an unstable, frantic woman, incapable of managing a generation-skipping trust. I sat at the respondent table, placing the heavy canvas bag on the floor near my feet. My new attorney, Silas, sat next to me. He wore his rumpled corduroy suit, a stark, jarring contrast to the bespoke tailoring across the aisle. Silas did not unpack thick binders. He simply pulled a single yellow legal pad from his briefcase and rested a cheap plastic pen on top of it. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. Magistrate Sullivan took his seat. He was an older man with silver wire-rimmed glasses and a deeply lined face. He reviewed the docket, running a hand over his tired eyes before signaling for the proceedings to begin. Vance stood up immediately, launching into his polished, well-rehearsed argument. He presented the motion for the emergency injunction, citing my postpartum depression records, the slurred, drunken voicemail, and my violent outbursts during the deposition. He painted a damning clinical portrait of a vulnerable old man, Harlan Beaumont, manipulated by a deeply disturbed daughter into signing away a massive fortune. Vance spoke for 20 minutes, weaving a narrative of elder abuse and psychiatric incompetence that sounded terrifyingly plausible. My father watched the judge nodding slowly, playing the role of the tragic, concerned patriarch. When Vance finally concluded his opening statement, taking his seat with a self-satisfied smirk, the judge turned his attention to our table. "Mr. Silas," the judge said, his voice carrying a dry, pragmatic edge, "the petitioner has submitted substantial documentation regarding your client emotional fitness. How does the respondent wish to proceed?" Silas stood up slowly, buttoning his corduroy jacket. He did not rush to the podium. He walked around our table, a casual, unhurried movement that instantly shifted the rhythm of the courtroom. "Your Honor," Silas began, his voice carrying a slight, raspy texture from years of cheap tobacco. "Opposing counsel has spent a great deal of time discussing my client's emotional state. We are not here to debate whether she had a difficult postpartum recovery. We concede that point. What we are here to debate is the petitioner's foundational claim. Opposing counsel asserts that Harlan Beaumont lacked testamentary capacity and was a victim of undue influence when he altered his trust. They claim he was a confused, manipulated old man." Silas turned and walked back to our table. He reached down into my open canvas tote bag. He bypassed the iron skillet and pulled out the stack of thick, leather-bound journals wrapped in protective plastic. He walked over to the bailiff desk, handing the heavy stack over. "We would like to enter Exhibit A into evidence," Silas announced, turning back to face the judge. "These are the personal shadow ledgers and private journals maintained by Harlan Beaumont dating back 4 decades, up until 3 days prior to his death." Vance jumped out of his chair so fast it scraped loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor," Vance shouted, his polished demeanor cracking slightly. "This is an ambush. These documents were never produced during discovery. We have no way to verify their authenticity. My client has never seen these books. They are clearly fabricated forgeries designed to salvage a failing defense." Silas did not flinch. "We did not produce them during discovery because my client only located them 4 days ago, hidden beneath a false floorboard in a condemned smokehouse in Cheatham County," Silas countered smoothly. "As for their authenticity, Your Honor, we welcome any handwriting analysis the court deems necessary. But I suggest you examine the binding and the phrasing before you sustain counsel objection." Judge Sullivan looked at the stack of journals resting on the bench. He removed his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled the top ledger toward him. He opened the cracked leather cover. The courtroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence. My father leaned forward, his elbows resting on the mahogany table, a flicker of genuine panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. He knew his father better than anyone, and the sudden appearance of hidden ledgers was a variable he had not calculated. Judge Sullivan flipped through the dense pages of financial calculations, his eyes scanning the meticulous compound interest projections Harlan had recorded for his secret loans to the Appalachian businesses. The judge paused near the middle of the book. He stopped reading the numbers and focused on a narrative entry detailing a business dispute Harlan had navigated in Greenville during the late 1980s. The judge read the passage silently, his lips moving slightly. He stopped. A strange, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his posture. He leaned closer to the page. Harlan had written a description of a rival timber mill owner, recording the man's deceptive practices. The entry read, "That man is as crooked as a dog hind leg, and twice as ugly when the sun hits him right." Judge Sullivan looked up from the journal. He did not look at Vance. He looked directly at Silas. The strict, formal magistrate suddenly let slip a faint but unmistakable East Tennessee mountain drawl, a cadence he usually kept carefully suppressed behind his judicial persona. My grandfather used that exact phrase when we lived up in Unicoi County. Judge Sullivan murmured almost to himself, "Crooked as a dog hind leg. You do not hear that in Belmead." He turned the page, reading another localized idiom Harlan had casually dropped into his financial notes, describing a heavy rainstorm as a real frog strangler. The authentic, hyper-regional phrasing of a man raised in the dirt could not be forged by a high-priced Nashville litigation team. It was the unsterilized dialect of the mountains, the very heritage my father had tried to erase. The judge recognized the voice of his own childhood echoing off the aged paper. "Objection overruled," Judge Sullivan declared, firmly replacing his glasses. "The court recognizes the preliminary authenticity of the documents. You may proceed, Mr. Silas." The color drained entirely from my father's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The polished, corporate Titan posture evaporated. He sank back into his heavy leather chair, staring at the journal sitting on the judge bench, realizing his entire legal strategy had just been eviscerated by the mountain slang he despised. Silas did not waste the momentum. He picked up the copy of the final journal entry and began to read aloud for the official court record. His raspy voice carried the immense weight of Harlan Final Testament, filling the quiet courtroom with absolute, undeniable finality. He read Harlan meticulous financial summaries, proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the patriarch possessed a lucid, razor-sharp intellect capable of executing a complex, generation-skipping trust. He read the entries detailing Harlan's secret funding of the working-class businesses, laying bare the double life he led to protect his roots. Then Silas turned to the final page. He paused, letting the silence stretch, amplifying the impact of the impending strike. He read the entry dated exactly 3 days before the birthday dinner. "Richard has lost his soul to the country club," Silas read, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "He measures a man worth by the tag on his suit and the zip code of his house. I watched him sneer at a waiter yesterday, and I realized the Beaumont legacy is rotting from the inside out. I spent my life hiding the dirt I came from, and my son became a sterile, empty shell because of it. I will not let him sterilize the next generation. I am bypassing him entirely. The boy gets the trust. The boy gets the land. He carries the dirt I was too cowardly to claim." The silence that followed the reading was deafening. The words hung in the air, a devastating, categorical disownment, delivered from beyond the grave. My father sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on the table. The man he worshipped, the Titan he spent 40 years trying to emulate and impress, had not just legally bypassed him, he had fundamentally rejected the very core of Richard's existence. He called him a sterile, empty shell on the public record, permanently destroying the aristocratic illusion my father valued above all else. Vance slowly sank back into his chair, closing his pristine legal folder without a word. He was a ruthless litigator, but he was also a pragmatist. He recognized a fatal blow when he saw one. There was no cross-examination that could undo the written intent of a lucid billionaire condemning his own son. The emergency injunction to seize my son trust was effectively dead. We had brought the heavy iron into the courtroom, and it had shattered the fragile porcelain foundation of my father empire, leaving absolutely nothing but dust in its wake. But surviving the litigation was only the first half of the war. Deciding what to do with the man sitting across the aisle, completely stripped of his power, was a choice that would define the rest of my life. The morning following the presentation of the hidden journals, the atmosphere inside the Davidson County Chancery Court had fundamentally transformed. The suffocating tension that had choked the room for 14 grueling months had evaporated, leaving behind a stark, clinical reality. Judge Sullivan took the bench with a heavy stack of finalized orders resting in front of him. He did not ask for further arguments from my father, lead litigator. He did not invite Vance to attempt a cross-examination of the historical evidence. The magistrate simply adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looked directly at the petitioner table, and delivered a ruling that severed my father's control over our lives forever. The judge dismissed the emergency injunction and the will contest with prejudice. That specific legal terminology meant the decision was absolute and irrevocable. My father was permanently barred from ever raising these fabricated claims in a court of law again. The judge officially ratified the generation-skipping trust, declaring it ironclad and fully executable under Tennessee law. I was legally recognized as the sole trustee managing the estate on behalf of my son. The 14-month siege, the starvation tactics, the public humiliation, the theft of my medical privacy, all of it ended, not with a chaotic screaming match, but with the quiet, definitive strike of a wooden gavel. I stood up from the respondent table, feeling a strange, weightless sensation spreading through my chest. Silas, my unpolished, brilliant attorney, packed his single yellow legal pad into his battered briefcase and offered me a slow, satisfied nod. We walked down the center aisle of the courtroom together, leaving the heavy bronze doors behind us. We stepped out of the courthouse and into the humid Nashville afternoon. The summer heat was already radiating off the downtown pavement, wrapping around us in a thick, heavy wave. The sounds of the city, the idling transit buses, the distant wail of a siren, the chatter of office workers on their lunch breaks, rushed back in. For over a year, my entire universe had been confined to legal maneuvering and desperate survival. Now, the world was simply spinning forward, unbothered by the collapse of the Beaumont aristocratic fortress. I walked down the wide concrete steps leading toward the street. Leo walked beside me carrying the heavy canvas tote bag, holding the antique cast-iron skillet and the leather journals. I saw my father waiting near the bottom of the staircase. Richard Beaumont was standing in the shadow of a large stone pillar, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his custom-tailored trousers. Stripped of his legal leverage and his access to the vast timber estate, he looked terrifyingly small. The immaculate posture that had defined his entire public existence was gone. His shoulders slumped forward, pulling the expensive fabric of his suit into awkward wrinkles. The exposure of his lifelong insecurities, recorded permanently in my grandfather's private ledgers, had fractured the armor he spent 40 years building. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the country club friends he worshipped were never going to save him from his own reflection. As I approached the bottom of the steps, my father stepped out of the shadows blocking my path. He opened his mouth, his jaw working silently for a fraction of a second. I could see the conflict raging behind his eyes. He wanted to speak. Perhaps he wanted to demand an apology for the public humiliation. Perhaps he wanted to play the victim one last time, citing his childhood trauma to justify his cruelty. Or, perhaps facing total ruin, he genuinely wanted to offer a real apology, hoping to salvage a relationship he had spent a year trying to destroy. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace to accommodate his internal struggle. I did not yell at him or demand closure. The burning, blinding rage that had consumed me during the deposition was gone, replaced by an unshakable, profound indifference. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to fit into his conditional love. I was done negotiating for my right to exist. I sidestepped him smoothly. Silas, however, paused just long enough to reach into his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick folded legal document sealed in a heavy manila envelope and handed it directly to Vance, who had followed my father down the stairs. I kept walking toward the street, but I knew exactly what was inside that envelope. It was the final strategic maneuver we had drafted the night before, and it was the ultimate, inescapable boundary. I was not going to leave my father destitute. Pushing him into utter bankruptcy and forcing him onto the street would have made me the exact monster he claimed I was in his court filings. I refused to let his cruelty infect my character. But I was certainly not going to hand in the keys to the empire either. The document Silas handed over authorized a strict, heavily monitored monthly stipend issued directly from my son, Generation Skipping Trust. The allowance was calculated with surgical precision. It provided just enough capital to cover the exorbitant property taxes on his Belmead mansion and his basic municipal utilities. It did not include a single surplus dollar for his country club initiation fees, his luxury car leases, or his philanthropic posturing. I had legally bound him to a gilded cage. He would keep his house, but he would have to live inside it, knowing that the lights were kept on by the very daughter he tried to ruin. He would have to check his bank account every month and see a deposit approved by a woman he had called mentally unfit. The man who despised poverty and viewed working-class heritage as a genetic stain was now entirely dependent on charity dispensed from the very bloodline he tried to erase. It was a poetic, devastating financial reality. I had forced him to live under my authority, stripping away his independence while keeping his aristocratic facade barely breathing. It was a punishment far more effective than poverty because it required him to swallow his pride every single day for the rest of his life. I reached the curb where our rusted pickup truck was parked. Leo opened the heavy metal door for me, the hinges groaning in the humid air. I climbed up onto the cracked leather bench seat, sliding over to make room. Leo tossed the heavy canvas tote bag onto the floorboard, where it landed with a solid, reassuring thud. He climbed into the driver's seat, shifting the old transmission into gear. We pulled away from the courthouse, leaving my father standing on the concrete steps, clutching a manila envelope he could never escape. I did not look back in the side mirror to watch him fade into the distance. Leo navigated the truck through the dense downtown traffic, steering us away from the polished glass high-rises and the pristine, manicured lawns of the ultra-wealthy enclaves. We merged onto the interstate, heading east toward the rolling green foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The landscape outside the window gradually shifted. The concrete structures gave way to dense ancient forests, sprawling pastures, and the rugged, uneven terrain that my grandfather had loved so fiercely. I rolled the window down, letting the warm, rushing wind blow through the cabin. The air smelled different out here. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and unfiltered freedom. The phantom anxiety that had governed my nervous system for 28 years, the constant, suffocating need to anticipate my family judgment, finally evaporated. It lifted off my chest like a physical weight, blowing out the window and scattering into the wind. I looked at Leo, his rough, calloused hands resting easily on the steering wheel, guiding us back to the nursery, where he grew life from the dirt. We were returning to a home that belonged entirely to us. We had survived the venom of a dying aristocracy, and we had done it without surrendering our souls. The inheritance was secure, but the real victory was the quiet space we had carved out for our son. He would grow up knowing exactly where he came from. He would know the strength of the hollers and the resilience of the working class. He would never have to apologize for his heritage. I leaned my head back against the worn leather seat, closing my eyes. The roar of the highway faded into a steady, comforting hum. The delicate, fragile era of Belmead porcelain was behind me, forever replaced by the profound, quiet peace of deep, unshakable roots. Looking out over the sprawling acres of Leo's Seed Nursery today, I often think about the grueling journey that brought us here to this quiet, unshakable peace. The dust from the courtroom has long settled, but the clarity it left behind remains sharp and permanent. When you spend your entire life confined inside a velvet cage, you start to believe that the bars are there to protect you. It takes a terrifying leap of faith to step out into the wild and realize you were only ever being kept prisoner by the unhealed trauma of other people. If there is anything this 14-month war taught me, it is that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with exclusive zip codes or country club initiation fees. Real wealth is the calloused hand that reaches across a diner table to pull you out of your own paralyzing self-pity. It is the grit to survive when the bank accounts are frozen and the resilience to build something beautiful out of the mud. I learned the hard way that family is not an automatic right granted by a shared bloodline. Family is a sacred title earned through loyalty, consistency, and mutual respect. My father shared my genetics, but my grandfather and my husband shared my soul. I also learned that setting a rigid boundary does not make you a villain, no matter how loudly the opposing side protests. Giving my father a heavily monitored stipend instead of handing him the empire was not an act of cruelty. It was a profound act of self-preservation. You are never required to set yourself on fire simply to keep your toxic relatives warm. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your own children is to burn a corrupted family tree to the ground so they can grow up planted in untainted soil. And perhaps the most vital lesson of all is that true healing is never found in playing the victim. When people try to crush you with their polite bureaucratic rules, you do not weep. You stop playing their fragile game, you dig deep to find your leverage, and you bring heavy cast iron into the courtroom. My son is growing up surrounded by tractors, historical smokehouses, and heirloom tomatoes, completely free from the suffocating, aristocratic expectations that almost destroyed me. The generational curse stops with me. I broke the cycle, so he will never have to doubt his worth. He knows his Appalachian heritage, and he wears it with undeniable pride. Thank you so much for walking through this incredible journey with me today here on Maya Tells Stories. It takes an immense amount of courage to share these deeply personal battles, and having a supportive community that truly understands makes all the difference in the world. If my story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to fight for your own peace against impossible odds, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription earnestly helps this channel be maintained and further developed, allowing Maya the storyteller to continue bringing you more captivating and empowering stories just like this one. We have so many more incredible journeys to share with you. Leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and remember that you always hold the power to write your own ending. I will see you in the next story.